I just wanted to talk about suffering for a moment. Suffering and life. We all experience suffering, and what do we mean by suffering? Well, a physical, an emotional, a spiritual hardship that we endure and face throughout our lives. And yes, there are various gradations of suffering that we all experience, but one thing is for certain: we will experience some form of hardship. The great oak tree behind me has some ivy wrapped around it, and that can restrict its growth in some senses and halt the sprouting of new branches. The oak behind me must learn to adapt and live with that ivy for the duration of time the ivy has wrapped itself around the oak. And for the reasons that ivy has wrapped around the oak has grown stronger, moved in new directions, maneuvered different resources it has pulled out through the root zone into either extending growth higher and higher to outclimb the ivy, or to distribute those nutrients to create wider and wider branches in order to provide itself some breathing room from the wrapping around of the ivy. And so what are we talking about here, Joseph? Well, we're talking about hardship leading to new growth and new development. Just as the ivy that surrounds this mighty oak behind me supports that oak in a paradoxical sense to grow and develop to new heights. We can think the same about growing tomato plants, for instance, or in fact any flowering plant that might be in the garden. And let's take consideration to adverse childhood experiences, first described as a relationship with Dr. Vincent Felitte and Dr. Robert Ander of the CDC Kaiser study, who noticed a significant impact on mortality rates for individuals who have experienced between 1 and 10 adverse childhood experiences, ranging from mental illness in the household, physical disability in the household, abuse, neglect, and so forth, substance misuse. 10 specific criteria, and those that experienced 4 or more often had an increased likelihood to mortality. But it's incredibly important to remember that this does not mean that it will happen, but gives us an understanding of how patterns in life can mobilize and how we, as beings with free will and agency, can steer ourselves in a more positive direction. Although at the time, like the mighty oak with his vines, or the individuals growing up with such adverse experiences, it may not seem that way whilst enduring the suffering. And we can often be propelled or prompted to ask the question, to contemplate, to plead, why is this suffering happening to me? Why me, O Lord, is a common phrase you will have heard, and more likely said or pleaded with yourself. So let's consider the ivy around the tree, mental, spiritual, and physical hardships that are endured, adverse childhood experiences, and of course the tomatoes or flowering plants that when we grow from young, we pinch the heads off, and that leads to a formation of 2 fruiting branches as opposed to 1. Now what's important is we don't break the main stem, and this will of course significantly impair the tomato plant or the flowering plant's growth. But the side branches, some bending, some twisting, some tethering to perhaps some guides that may support the growth of the plants will actually, in fact, lead it to have a higher yield of fruit or flowers than the tomato plant left alone of its own accord to grow taller and taller and taller, who may just have a few fruiting branches, as opposed to the tomato plant that has been trained and twisted and bent. So suffering supports us to grow, supports us to develop. And at the time it doesn't seem that way, when the endurance is felt at its highest, when the experience is bereavement, relational struggles, instability in the home, family disputes, existential crisis, whatever it may be, it won't feel like a lesson or a growth. And in the hospital where my mother was poorly, my father used to read a saying above one of the ward doors: "Time heals all wounds." And I remember him recalling at the time what a load of nonsense this was. However, 10 years have passed, and he laughs and reminds me that time does heal all wounds as we grow and develop from that moment. And so what I really want to bring to light or reflect on here is that suffering and the endurance of suffering leads us to grow and develop, just like this oak tree or like the tomato plant. Just as a bearded dragon or reptile sheds skin and grows anew, we too shed our skin and grow anew through different chapters of our lives, whether that be throughout childhood, perhaps a teenage phase, adulthood, young adulthood, midlife crisis, grandchildren, children, older age. Whatever stage of life and development you are in, you will continue to grow and develop. And that leads me to my next point, which we're all too familiar with, the life of Jesus Christ. The birth at the nativity scene in Bethlehem, the life in the temple, the wedding at Cana and so forth, the suffering, the passion, the lead up to the crucifixion, the death, Jesus crucified, and the resurrection from the dead after 3 days, and the tomb. And so just as suffering is a human experience that's experienced by all of us, no matter who we are, where we come from, or what stage of life we're in, so too is birth, life, suffering, death, and resurrection. Well, hold up a minute, Joseph. Well, I'm not too sure about the death and resurrection part. Perhaps there will be a moment we all draw our last breath, but will we be resurrected? Well, I want to pause for a moment and take this pattern, this model of birth, life, suffering, death, and resurrection, and put it from a macro scale to a micro scale, and say, throughout our life, and Rogers speaks about this in incongruence, when we're psychologically comfortable, we're not in psychological discomfort, we have an alignment between our actual self, who we are, and our ideal self, who we see ourselves to be, perhaps when we look in the mirror. And psychological discomfort occurs when we are different or slightly apart from who we see ourselves to be or who we would like to see ourselves as. A misalignment between our actual self, who we are, and our ideal self, who we would like to be. A few more nuances than that, but I feel that's adequate for this short reflection today. And so just as self-actualization, this process of moving our actual self and our ideal self together to reach a state of congruence and psychological comfort, a lack thereof psychological distress, we grow and we develop and we move closer. And when we reach almost a state of self-actualization, we then feel a new emerging, a new path, a new direction, a new goal. Perhaps we've been promoted, we've got that house we really want, And then new goals emerge, perhaps academic, relational, travel, more free time, more children, whatever it may be. We don't stop growing. And so to put that life of Jesus, of birth, life, suffering, death and resurrection, into a microcosm, throughout our life, we are in a constant cycle of birth, life, suffering, death and resurrection. And by that I mean, when we reach this period of psychological comfort, there's a rebirth of who we are. Perhaps at school, at university, the first job, marriage, first house, grandchildren, whatever it is, wherever we see ourselves or are in reality on that progression through life. We have a series of cycles where we're born anew, we live happily in that newness. There's then a suffering, a pain point occurs with it. And from that pain point, a death of that new life and a rebirth of another new life. But it's not another new life, it's our life yet, our life still. And what we have done is we've shed our skin and we've grown again. We've grown again, we've grown again. And just like this tree trunk that I'm sat on here and this mighty oak tree behind me, when it is chopped, there'll be rings and layers, rings and layers, rings and layers. And we can count each of those rings for an annum year. A new year of growth and a new year of life. And each ring in this mighty oak behind me and the trunk of this tree that I've sat upon is a new cycle of birth, life, suffering, death and resurrection. And so if you're sat at home watching this today or know someone that is suffering, irrelevant of the gradation, we all experience life differently. Just remember and perhaps tentatively encourage those around you that suffering is a process of growing, and with time that may become more clear. But whilst we are suffering, that all may be well and good to reflect upon now or later. What are some practical things we can do to support ourselves? Well, I'm outside in the beautiful countryside now. Walking keeps the body active, gives us fresh supply of oxygen, and allows us to connect with the natural world around us. Too many sit in sedentary lifestyles on screens. Not to knock them, they're an advent of this modern epoch that have enabled huge growth technologically for communication, work, education, and so forth. But there can be a sedentary lifestyle, being inside. So getting out, getting in nature, having a walk, breathing fresh air, and reflecting on your life and who you are and where you want to be. Writing those down. Who am I now? Where do I want to be? And each day looking at that, perhaps jot on a notepad, and asking yourself the question, am I closer to who I want to be than I was yesterday? And so let's pause and think, just a quick summary of what we spoke about. Suffering is part of life. Mental, physical, spiritual hardships we will endure, all of us, to varying gradations. But that suffering is growth and development. It means we're growing. If we weren't suffering, we wouldn't be growing and we would be stagnant. And perhaps that's a worse pain in itself. Secondly, we all have birth, life, suffering, death, and resurrection within our human experience. Suffering is just one component of that, both on a macrocosm and a microcosm. These perpetual cycles throughout our life of rebirth and anew, as we move in and out of actual self and ideal self alignment, in and out of states of congruence and incongruence. And if you are struggling, speak to someone. Speak to yourself. Speak to nature. And flesh out some of those ideas or discourses that keep you up at night by yourself. Thank you for your time. I appreciate time is valuable, and you spent the time to watch this video today. If you are suffering, just know we all are. We're with you, and it means you're growing and developing.